Today's story is about $250 million. Basically, right, this sum, $250 million, was meant to go to the developers of Subnautica 2. Now, that is under the condition of them successfully releasing the game this year, essentially. Now, of course, they haven't released the game this year, and they won't release the game this year. That's because the publisher Krafton has fired the leadership, delayed the game, and seemingly denied staff that bonus. Seemingly. People are furious, but not just the ousted leaders of the company. That's because there was a lot of drama, Krafton got a lot of flack, and then Krafton hit back. They're now alleging that leadership were absent, that they were doing personal vanity projects, like this Christmas movie, because I guess that's what that guy was doing. And Krafton essentially says it's their failure, the leadership who are now fired, that is why players are not getting a great game anytime soon. Obviously, said leaders are not particularly happy about any of this, so they've responded back, they're suing, and now, after a heap of pressure, literally just before we were going to wrap this video up, it now seems that Krafton is doing something about the $250 million. Or at the very least, a smaller slice of that $250 million that was actually due to go to staff. There's a lot to get through today, so let's get stuck in. I'll begin with the history you need for this video. So, Unknown Worlds Entertainment are a pretty huge success story, and Charlie Cleveland is the face of the studio. So here's how they basically got to where they're at right now. They built a mod for Half-Life called Natural Selection, which really was fantastic. That then led to them forming a studio in 2001. Now after that, they built Natural Selection 2. Honestly, it was a banger. I played it on Total Biscuit's recommendation, but after that, they found their real success with a game called Subnautica. And Subnautica really is good. And comparisons to their old games aren't even close, at least in terms of finances. That's because 9 years after early access, Subnautica has sold over 5 million copies. So that's an absolutely humongous amount of money. But then, following that, came a rather large financial moment, and that is where the PUBG publisher Krafton enters the picture. So they bought the studio for $500 million in 2021, though the studio would still operate independently. Now, part of this deal was the performance bonus. We'll very much get to that. And according to sales reports, Unknown Worlds were making serious money. As an example, right, in 2020, they had no new releases, no new ports. It was just them ticking along with their regular revenue, and with that, they reported a $25.8 million profit. So that's pretty goddamn incredible. And while the studio would detour a little to make a war game called Moonbreaker, Subnautica 2 was always their next big project. Essentially, Subnautica 2 is the real thing that Krafton wanted, that they cared about, and well, it's one that they did expect to release this year. But of course, then the news came that Krafton axed the entire leadership team. Things all started to get crazy a few weeks ago. So this guy, Steve, is now the new CEO of Unknown Worlds. And the old leadership are gone. That means the studio founder, Charlie Cleveland, is out, the CEO, Ted Gill, is out, and the special projects director, Max McGuire, is also out. They were all let go. Now, Steve came from Krafton's other big team called Striking Distance Studios. You may remember them from the Callisto Protocol. So, a little bit of an unfortunate situation. Now, according to Krafton, this change in leadership would bring, quote, renewed energy and momentum to Subnautica 2. And through all of the comms that we got from Krafton, there's a very, very clear framing. It's all about the players. As an example, CH Kim, the CEO, made it pretty clear when he said this: there is nothing more important than the gamer experience. We owe our players nothing less than the best possible game as soon as possible. Which, you know, is not really a controversial statement, though it sure does run counter to the claims of Krafton slashing Striking Distance's development timeline on Callisto Protocol. Don't really think that was good for the gamers, but anyway, it's the words of a CEO, so they're inherently just a little bit strange. Now, here's where things got a little bit odd. They included a paragraph about game development milestones. These are fairly simple, they're absolutely common across the entire industry. Here, they define them as a game having to meet clearly defined metrics and targets by certain times, or else your funding stops. Which basically just means, whatever your period is, you submit your milestone, if it's approved, then you get your next chunk of money, so you can go and then make the next milestone. Now, Krafton essentially explained that Unknown Worlds' new leadership fully supported that process, which of course has got a bit of an implication that the old leadership didn't support that process, that they were keeping the game from fans. Fans that I should say weren't thrilled about any of this and were already worried about the game. Now that's because there was actually a drama in 2024. Essentially, Krafton told investors the game would adopt a game as a service model with enhanced replayability. Ooh, when it released later that year. Obviously, it didn't release in 2024. What's odd, though, is Krafton said that to investors, but then Unknown Worlds disagreed in public. They said that it wouldn't be full games as a service, and the Krafton were just talking about them having updates and optional co-op. So no battle passes, no seasons, things like that. And that did kind of spook the community a little bit, that there seemed to be a miscommunication. Obviously, though, in hindsight, it looks like cracks by that stage had already been forming. It's really bizarre whenever a developer and a publisher are kind of issuing statements that contradict each other. Very bizarre and obviously pretty shit for the community. But anyway, to return to the present, Krafton actually then went and released a follow-up post. And it is telling. They essentially reaffirmed that there are no monetization changes to the game, that early access was still coming, and this really is the curious one, the team working on the game day to day has remained unchanged. And that is a strange statement, because the implication here is that the ousted founders were not working on the game day to day. So that was a bit weird, this follow-up post from Krafton. But then to respond to that post, Charlie Cleveland posted a heartfelt blog over on Reddit. And this post essentially covered his departure and his belief that Subnautica 2 was actually ready for early access, but that it was not his call to release, that it was Krafton's call to release, and that they wanted a delay. Now you're probably thinking, what about the $250 million? Yeah, we're going to get into that. It's now time for the Bloomberg investigation. So, Krafton delayed the game to 2026. They essentially said that it needed more features and that it needed more content. But Bloomberg writer Jason Schreier actually had sources inside Unknown Worlds, and they suggest a very different reason that is, there and about the size of $250 million. Essentially, they put it that the delay would deny staff their share of the $250 million performance bonus, and that the ousted leadership had allegedly promised the 100 or so staff a share of that bonus. Now, that's a promise for a share relating to 100 people. That is also on top of documentation that Jason Schreier saw, and those docs stated that 40 staff would get 10% split amongst them. But of course, it's a performance bonus, it's not a given. Now, to unlock this bonus, right, they needed to hit 2025 revenue targets. The thing is, though, those revenue targets were high, meaning that without the launch of Subnautica 2, they would be impossible to hit. So effectively, it was a big bonus if the game came out in 2025. And that ultimately meant there was a real clear perception here that Krafton had basically just delayed the game to avoid paying out money, because $250 million is quite a lot. Now, Krafton say the game isn't ready, but then we've got the founder saying that the game was ready, and Jason Schreier is also reporting that staff were on board with the release as well, which is actually a little bit of a problem. How can both be true if Krafton had outlined clearly defined metrics and targets as a factor of development in their initial statement? Essentially, Krafton saying, hey, milestones, this stuff wasn't being hit. So what is the deal here? Either development met the terms of the contract or it didn't. So whenever these people are saying the game actually was ready to go, what does that mean? Is that just their opinion in a world where they hadn't met their milestones? It's unclear and honestly quite bizarre. Now, Krafton then told Eurogamer that the delay decision came before these leadership changes and that it was based on playtest feedback. In their words, and again, this is usual publisher talk, they say it's about a commitment to quality and delivering the best possible experience for players. And they said it was not influenced by any contractual or financial considerations. Yeah, they obviously know that there's a really bad look. But of course, it's pretty goddamn obvious that even if Krafton says, oh no, that $250 million, that had nothing to do with our decision, well, they obviously would still get to keep the $250 million. I simply don't believe that was isolated and absolutely not a factor. I just think that's way too much of a stretch. Anyway, by now you can see this really has the makings of just a typical game industry story, right? A lot of disagreement, a lot of anger, made very juicy by a big bonus. And Krafton were obviously, I think, overall PR-wise, absolutely goddamn hated by this point in time. And you can't deny just how bad of a look all of this is. Their PR was up shit creek. But this is where the story gets a bit more interesting, because rather than search for a paddle, they just called in a nuke. Take a look at this pop-up announcement found on Krafton's homepage. I mean, the title says it all. To our 12 million fellow subnauts, inevitable leadership change driven by project abandonment despite holding 90% of earnout for themselves. Yeah, it's a real snappy title, guys. But essentially in this, Krafton lay the blame at the feet of the old leadership. Krafton says that they abandoned their responsibilities. According to Krafton, Subnautica 2 was meant to release early 2024. Then it was delayed. Now, they say they asked Charlie and Max to rejoin development, but they refused, which I'm sure would be, surprising to all of us who probably assumed they had something to do with development at that point in time. According to Krafton, though, Charlie instead was spending his time on making Moonbreaker and then making a film. And by the way, what the hell is this film? It's called Nutmeg and Mistletoe. It's a Christmas comedy seeking SNL vets. Some lovely, really odd-looking Mid-Journey art for its poster. Very bizarre. Now, Krafton say that this did actually have a material impact in Subnautica 2. That's because without, quote, core leadership, there was confusion. There were delays, and Krafton say they feel a profound sense of betrayal. I don't really know if a corporate entity can actually feel betrayal, but perhaps the people at it do. And if what they're saying is true, yeah, that does actually sound pretty ridiculous. Anyway, according to them, this is why the leadership had to change. Even though Krafton's public positioning is very much that they still support the actual team making the game. So, in this post, the Unknown Worlds executives really just come off as kind of lounging around, not taking things seriously, and profiting from their staff's labor, where they would have been getting the vast majority of the bonus, while seemingly abandoning core development on Subnautica 2. At least that's what Krafton are alleging. But it is also deeply strange because the story then changed again. This is a milestone doc from Krafton, and it's absolutely not the sort of thing that you would normally see, which, well, is interesting because it was leaked. Now, we gotta ask ourselves, who leaked this and what perspective do they have? Because when you look at this document, it certainly does not look good for Unknown Worlds. That leads me to think that Krafton, or maybe someone Krafton related, is responsible for the leak. Obviously, that's just speculation, but anyway, let's take a look at it. It's pretty interesting. It essentially shows that the game's scope has been reduced significantly since the targeted 2023 launch. And from Krafton's perspective, the game experienced what they say is an overall shift in direction during development. They say that it lacked the level of polish and market impact required, and I mean, the numbers are rough. They say they planned a 30% increase in content for the early access launch. And look, just glancing through the numbers in the doc, it really does look bad for the studio. That being said, it doesn't immediately prove Krafton's case. It does back a lot of things up, but as an example, is what exists ready for early access? I mean, Krafton say it isn't, but the founder says it is. Staff apparently told Jason Schreier that it is, and we the public simply don't know. Though it's only right I point out a fairly obvious incentive, so staff and leadership do all have a large incentive to ship the game this year, because that would unlock the $250 million bonus. So let's say 90% stays with leadership, that would leave 10% for staff. Now, the doc Jason saw had a 10% share split between 40 people. It's an average of 62.5k each. Obviously, it's less if you're talking about 100 staff, but I'd also ask you to think about studio power dynamics, because it's probably safe to assume that seniority would play somewhat of a role in that bonus distribution. That could obviously influence how people are leaking to the press, which is essentially to say that with the information we've got now, I don't really trust anyone involved in this story because it all just does look sketchy as hell. Now, some questions do remain for Krafton though. I mean, if the game was supposed to launch in 2023 or 2024, then clearly it missed previous milestones. So why wait a year to change structure? Like, what's going on there? And similarly, Krafton said that the game suffered from confused direction, but you've got developers in the project being unchanged, and all of this being placed in leadership. So what's going on there? Is it really that the lack of these three leaders was so goddamn pivotal in the thing failing that Krafton thinks they can get rid of them, get a new CEO, and deliver the game with the exact same team? Is that really what's going on? It does sound pretty weird. And when you think about how 90% of that $250 million bonus was reportedly, though they do dispute it, going to go to just, those three people, to the leadership. I mean, you can see getting rid of the three of them and then giving bonuses to the staff that will remain. So obviously, this is a goddamn mess, which means it's hardly a surprise that Charlie Cleveland, the founder of the studio, is suing. You may have just noticed I'm wearing different clothes. That's because, once again, this case has changed. It's honestly kind of crazy. So here's the big update. Charlie Cleveland announced that he would be filing against Krafton with ex-leadership. But what's neat is now we actually know exactly what for. And that's because he released a redacted public version of the complaint. So they allege a breach of contract on multiple fronts. First, it's terminating the founders without cause. Second, taking actions to reduce the earnout bonus without talking to the founders. third, removing contractually mandated operational control from the founders. And especially relevant to the case is that this included development and launch decisions. Now, when you read through the actual text, 90% of this filing is setting out the leadership's overall experience, essentially their version of how the last few years went. Now remember, these are all allegations being made by the Unknown Worlds leadership team. They're not proven, but there's a few instances where there is some corroborating evidence, so I'll flag that whenever it comes up. Okay, here's their side of the story, or at least their claim of what has happened. The leadership worked with Krafton to change their positions, basically moving to company-wide titles and not being directly involved with Subnautica 2 anymore, or with things like day-to-day people management. That's obviously a large clash with what Krafton were saying. And on the film side of things, Cleveland actually alleges something kind of interesting, that he was in LA partially to work on a Subnautica film on behalf of Krafton. Basically, he was there doing networking for the film project, which again is certainly something that Krafton failed to mention in their public statements. So that's kind of suspicious. Now, talking about numbers, right? The starting position was strong. Subnautica 2 had 2.5 million wish lists in Steam. Playtests for the game were broadly positive, and that is a fact corroborated by external testers that Bloomberg was able to speak to. Now, this overall meant that sales projections actually exceeded expectations for the game. And when I say sales, I'm talking about actual revenue, not just game copies. So the revenue is looking good, even without things like, say, previous Subnautica games. So the result is that, yeah, the 250 million bonus would have been nearly fully paid out. And that, they say, is when things allegedly turned kind of dark. They essentially claim that Krafton began a campaign of sabotage. They started pulling marketing materials, they ended partnerships, they started refusing to actually finish needed pre-launch tasks, and here's where it gets real specific. So staff at Krafton's American publishing arm noticed that something went wrong, and they then brought that to leadership's attention. What did they find? Well, they found that the Korean office was looking for a way out, essentially a way to avoid honoring the deal. And then came a major change, again, in their version of the story. And that change is the American publishing team then gets replaced, and a Korean publishing team takes over. And this new team, well, they're unfamiliar with PC games. They've got no English language skills. Cleveland then alleges that Krafton's CEO said something damning over a lunch, that the payout would have been, quote, disastrous for Krafton. Now, Krafton later claimed that this was mistranslated. But obviously, it really does look bad. And then Unknown Worlds points out something kind of important, that they never had a translation issue in the 4 years of their partnership. So that's basically them trying to poke holes in the response from Krafton. Now, the pressure then continued, right? Krafton kept presenting reports that were claiming Subnautica 2 needed delays. Unknown Worlds found the evidence to be uncompelling. So what happened when Unknown Worlds Entertainment pushed ahead? Well, Krafton, they say, pulled everything. Translations, analytics, legal support, policy support, just loads of stuff. And they even cancelled a marketing deal with PC Gamer that has since been corroborated. Basically, Subnautica 2 was supposed to get like a sort of cover issue featuring PC Gamer. That's been pulled. PC Gamer did confirm that that happened. It's not just that, though. The allegations do get worse. So Krafton apparently stopped responding to emails. This cost the team valuable partnerships. They even published unapproved statements to Unknown Worlds' website, which really does feel bad. Now, all this aligned with legal pressure through 2025, and we essentially have negotiations between the founders continuing, and then them finding out that they have been fired. They say without cause. Now, the leadership is suggesting that this puts the Subnautica 2 launch at risk. Then, of course, there's the talk of the feedback being poor. Now, we got a statement from Krafton to GameFile, and it states, quote, decisions were made to ensure Subnautica 2 is the best possible game and lives up to fan expectations. But there's actually one more development. You see, after the lawsuit and the public backlash, Krafton have then tried some damage control. They essentially wanted to get people back on their own side. Now, Jason Schreier had sources present documentation to him about the bonus schedule, so it is apparently being extended into 2026. And what's going to happen is Krafton will advance part of a separate 2026 profit-sharing pool into 2025. So basically, they don't want staff scared about losing the bonus. But here's the thing, so far in how this is being reported, we don't have clarification on whether that's the entire 250 million bonus, including all the stuff that was meant to go to the founders and maybe any of the sort of verbal things the founders had said about redistributing, more than just 10% over to the staff. So we don't know if it's the full amount of money or just the 10% of the 250 million that was due to go to staff. Because obviously, if Krafton are able to get the 25 million, give that to staff, and save themselves 225 million by cutting off the leadership, well, that would be pretty sweet for them. But okay, let's pull this all into some form of conclusion, because look, I am aware that this has been honestly a total shit show of a story, and one that's pretty long. So far, what I'm willing to say then is that I am quite split. It really seems to me that there's just a very clear failure in communication with each other. And then you get into the financial incentives. Those are so goddamn obvious. And again, it's just allegations right now that we've got that lawsuit stuff unsealed. The whole thing about the US team being swapped with the Korean team, and then that statement from the Krafton CEO about it being financially disastrous. If that stuff can be proven, if there's evidence of that, I think it would be absolutely damning and would, well, just kill a lot of Krafton's PR. But you see, throughout all of this, there's another thing that I cannot get out of my head, and that is Glenn Schofield. He led development on the Callisto protocol, and if you remember that game from launch, and I hope you didn't buy it at launch, well, it was quite the disaster. And reflecting on his experience making that game, Glenn said his largest regret was not fighting back whenever Krafton moved their release date forward. Yes, forward. So the opposite of a delay. It was moved forward, and they didn't give him the resources that he would need to actually pull that off in time. So no wonder Callisto Protocol was a mess on launch. And because we've got an allegation like that floating around, and that they were ultimately willing to shit out Callisto Protocol, I find it hard to trust Krafton whenever they say that all of this stuff is, of course, in the service of the players. And it's not just Subnautica fans that I'm worried for here, it's also Tango Gameworks. You may remember them, of course, from Hi-Fi Rush, and how it was just disappointing and insane that Xbox basically pulled their funding, and it looked like that truly would have killed the studio. Now, what then happened is Krafton acquired the studio, and they lapped up so much positive PR. It would certainly be sad if they then got what seems to now be the typical Krafton experience of just a lot of chaos, a lot of he said, she said, and stuff that absolutely does seem to be, at the very least for the people involved, pretty goddamn painful. Now, in a way, all of this is driven by money, right? And that is part of a broader trend, a financial tightening that is slaughtering entire swathes of the industry, including ones that are practically unnoticed. And if you want to learn more about that and how specifically a game that mirrors so much with Expedition 33 basically just died, well, watch this video next.